see the Dallas football game?
I didn't watch it. I heard it was pretty tragic.
The end is the mistake that no Madden player would ever make. Ever make.
No, why not?
No. Also, I love everyone on Twitter has shifted to being NFL coaching experts now. It's pretty amazing. It was like 40 seconds left, no timeouts. They're on the 40-yard line, and their QB runs it right up the middle, and it's a running play, gets tackled, so the clock doesn't stop.
Oh gosh!
And so then there's 10 seconds left, and he's their whole offense is like rushing to set up, no timeout.
Yeah.
And they do the get the ball and do the QB spike because it's a first down. First down, so throw down away. They're down by 6 points or something, and they do the snap, and the whistle blows.
Oh my gosh!
The sequence is so fast. It's like snap, whistle, spike, and they're like, okay, that's the end of the game.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
Devastating.
Madden player would ever make that mistake.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. That sucks.
Yeah.
So they're out.
Yeah, I guess. I don't really watch football, but
Yeah.
Played a lot of Madden in my younger days.
Right. I haven't been. Well, the Pats lost.
They're
big time.
Are they in the playoffs?
They were. They were in the wild card,
but now they're not.
Yeah, they lost to. I don't know who they lost to. Oh, they lost to Tom Brady. They lost to the Bucks. I think they got destroyed.
And they're not in the playoffs?
They were in the playoffs. It was the wild card. I guess I don't know if that means they're not.
It was a wild card.
They didn't get
game.
a berth. They didn't actually. It was wild card weekend.
Oh, I thought it was still regular. This is I don't know anything.
Yeah,
about
football, I know. Oh no, sorry. The Pats lost to the Bills. I'm sorry.
Okay. The Bills are
the Bucks did win. They destroyed the Eagles. But no, the Bills. Remember, the Bills have been awesome the last couple of years, and earlier in the season, they're one of the best teams in the NFL, and then they really fell off, and then so it was which team are you going to get? And the Pats got the version of the Bills that was the best team in the NFL. Josh Allen was just dominating, great runner, and So I kind of loosely followed the Pats this year just because I wasn't super excited about it, but. The college football playoff game a couple weeks ago, the Georgia-Bama game was the most fun I've had watching football in a long time.
Nice.
It was awesome. They showed it brought me right back to being college because they showed downtown Athens, and it was just the most drunk people ever, all just climbing fire poles and standing on cars and barking because they're the Bulldogs, and it just brought me right back to 06 and 08 when I was in Gainesville and we won. It was the same thing. Everyone just rushes downtown. It's a good time.
You guys were Gators.
Yeah.
So what did you? If you didn't bark, what did you do?
You just
bite off
Gator bait,
legs.
chomp chomp. You go like that, which I feel is a little more classy than just barking. But maybe that's just
so much more classy.
I'm a Gator fan. Yeah, I said go Dogs for my buddy a couple times, but I will never bark. That's a bridge too far. It was a really fun game though, and they had lost to them about a month ago in the SEC championship. Georgia lost to Bama. Bama gave them their one loss this year. And so it was awesome redemption story. It was like a Quentin Tarantino movie, just
nice.
Revenge. The setup was perfect. So that was fun. Yeah. And then, Ryan is going to be in New Orleans for the Final Four this year for March Madness. And it's in New Orleans. The games are.
What are they doing?
So I might be able to go into a Final Four game.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
They usually do it all over the country, and then the Final Four going to be in New Orleans.
I think so.
Cool.
I think that's right. Yeah, so that'd be fun. But yeah, it's a good time. Cool, man. So let's see. What is it, already third week of January? Wow, that's pretty crazy.
Years flying by.
Yeah, it's been a good few weeks though. Getting our videos out. Did the other Suspense video last week, and best part about teaching is learning, right?
Oh yeah.
People ask me sometimes comments on my YouTube videos. They're where do you learn this stuff? It's not there yet. And man, my answer is always the same. If you have to teach something, that's if you want to learn something, then teach it. Even if you don't have an audience or a student, just make an explanatory video or post from first principles and stop whenever you don't completely understand something. There's always that moment you're explaining something and you get to that part and you're just and you kind of like hand wave it, you go through it. But like, if you always stop when you hit those until you understand enough to say it, then like it's pretty good.
I remember during the Ember meetups, Luke used to try to get people to give talks, and they would say, "Oh, I don't know enough about it." And he's like, "Well, you know what the best way to learn about it is to give a talk."
Right, exactly.
And it's so true.
No, it really is. So my video last week was about inserting like a suspense boundary after the initial render. And I go through this whole thing where I explain how, effects, the way they work with suspense is that they don't run until after all the components have finished suspending, because that's when the render actually happens. And we use that fact to insert the boundary so that you have different rendering behavior, loading behavior, UI when the second suspense happens. And then I was talking about on Twitter, and I'll link to this thread because it ended up being a pretty cool thread because, suspense for data fetching, which is what my last two videos have been about, is not actually ready yet. It's not advertised or documented as part of suspense, even though suspense is in React 18 and React 18 is in release candidate. So they're like fixing bugs and they're not really changing behaviors in 18. So it's like the question then becomes like, why do you have suspense but not for data fetching? And so, the last 2 weeks as I've been like making these demos and videos, I was just making sure to learn about it, asked about it on Twitter. And I asked Paul Henschel, who's this guy who has this library React Suspend, which just gives you a function that you can pass an async function into to suspend your app. So if you need like set up Firebase or anything. And, in the details, it's like throwing a promise and all that stuff, but you don't have to worry about that. They have like a stable place you can, do that. And
yeah, because I remember the first suspense component you did. It's like, oh, I need a stable promise.
Right.
It needs to be a module scope.
Right.
So it's just like
it's a pain in the butt.
There's just a lot of it's a lot harder than just throw a promise.
Exactly.
It has to be the same promise.
Exactly. So that takes care of that detail. And I was like tweeting about this, and I was like, this is actually pretty cool from like just a perspective of you're starting React and you need to fetch data, because if you look at it, it's just like rendering a component, suspend, and then like fetch JSON, and then you render your component, and like that's it. There's no. It's like you're writing it's like as if React supported async components, basically, right? Mm-hmm. And it works exactly how you would expect. So it's pretty awesome. And then Paul actually was responding on Twitter, and he was like, "Yeah, I've been using this for years. I don't know why it's not talked about more, but like we've been experimenting with it, and like I wish more people use this." And then Dan Abramov actually got involved too, because I was asking, why is it like there's some piece I'm missing about the fact that like throwing promises as a way to suspend in React that is the API. It's not changing. So then the question becomes, why can't we do that to fetch data? And Dan chimed in and kind of answered that. So I figured we could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it has to do with this, the idea of the cache part. And
can we, I guess before you start, like, just my impressions when I hear this, like suspense is not ready for data fetching, makes me think like I can't get data from like a remote service with suspense. Mm-hmm. And there's something that's not lining up there, because I've seen you do that. Yeah.
Well, that's part of why I was having this whole conversation, because I was like, so what about this is unstable, basically, Mm-hmm. And it has to do with the cache. So that's a good place to start, right? I mean, that is so let's walk through the mechanism of
should we like define data fetching? Because again, it's just like I've seen people fetch data with suspense. So,
yeah.
And yet I hear that suspense isn't ready for data fetching. So like there's just something that's not
it might be. Yeah. So let's walk through it. So I think the only officially supported use case for suspense right now is lazy loading components.
Like React.lazy or whatever?
I think so.
Okay.
And you can lazy load a chunk of JavaScript, a component, and let's say you have an admin that you only want for like admins, so you don't load it on initial load. You visit the page, and then you do React.lazy, fetch the component. And so that suspends. So now you can add a suspense boundary in the tree, and it renders the loading state. So that all works. Now, the question is, I'm just going to be speculating a little bit, but I think this is what differentiates it from data fetching. Did you just see my scar, my CrossFit scar?
No,
it's pretty gross,
nice.
Right? Tall man trying to do too many pull-ups for his own good. I don't know if there's any cache built in for the lazy component. I think maybe it just delegates to the browser, because if you fetch a chunk that's fingerprinted, like React doesn't really have to worry about caching that. That's a browser concern. So let's say you go to visit the admin, you fetch admin123.js, you go back away, and then you come back and get it again. It'll just be there. Like, or maybe it's not, maybe the code's already loaded. Maybe it is already loaded and it's not going to refetch it. But even if it did, like, it wouldn't be a problem.
You're basically saying, like, even though it's just going to use a promise and it's going to be async, like, it doesn't actually have to go to the network and fetch the thing.
Yeah.
Because it's going to get, like, the browser's just going to return the thing that it returned previously. So
yeah.
There's like a natural cache.
Yeah. Also, bundles are typically immutable.
That's where I thought you were going.
That's where I think it is. So, like, if you fetch admin version 123, then it's immutable and you never have to bust the cache. You never have to invalidate the cache.
The difference between lazy loading a component and fetching data is like the component's never going to change.
Yeah.
And the data might change.
Exactly. So if you fetch an API endpoint API/users, it's going to be different. So this is why I think, again, kind of thinking out loud, but why a cache is a more necessary part of the data fetching story, because you could do it where there's no cache. So your component renders, it says use query API users, and then it renders some JSX. And but usually you have more things going on. And if you just let it fetch the users, let's say it's a network call, it takes like a couple seconds, and then the component's ready and it mounts. That's fine. But obviously in a real world app, that's like not going to work, because if you navigate away and come back, or something happens while that fetch is happening, it's a long enough process that you want those users to be there when you come back to it. So you could cache it yourself. You could say, you could put it in some state in your component.
Yeah, like what Apollo.
You could put it in a context, right? Apollo.
Module scope it. So let's just keep it nice and simple.
Let users, and then module scope it, and then only fetch if you don't have anything there or whatever. So of course you can solve that problem with it. But Dan was saying, obviously there's way too many benefits that we want to standardize the way this happens, so that libraries and other parts of React can take advantage of this single cache. So if you need to invalidate some state, you can do it in a clean way. So I basically think at a 30,000 foot view, he used this analogy of like installing an install script. And if you had an install script, you fetch, library 1 from Node modules, library 2 from NPM, library 1, library 2, library 3, all takes time and installs. And then you hit your script and CI and it errors, right? So if you want to rerun the install script after fixing the bug, you don't want to go fetch npm 1, package 1, package 2, package 3 all over again. Like a good install script would know like steps 1 through 3 were successful and we're retrying step 4, right? So you could imagine an install script that never does that and just runs over again fresh every single time. But that'd be a very bad install script. Like none of our development environments would work, because like if every time we did npm run we had to start from scratch, that's like it's a big enough part of the problem that for an install script to be considered like usable and good, that's like a necessary thing. And I think that's what he's saying about data fetching with Suspense. So yes, you can fetch data with Suspense. And a lot of these libraries have their own caches, but until the cache is delivered that's part of React and actually coordinates the standard way to like evict and invalidate existing data, the story is incomplete, basically.
Okay. I think there might be a little more here in that you like, if you're doing like a reload, you want like one cache that's empty and one cache that's full, because you want to be like displaying the things while you're reloading.
Yeah.
And you might think like, oh, but I can just make an event handler that calls reload.
Right.
But I think that gets a little messy, because now like our components are back to managing their loading state, because if the component is calling reload. And so I think there's some, I think this is the stuff that like you can't do in user land, or it's extremely hard to do in user land.
Yeah.
And the React cache is going to provide. So I can be in a state with data fetch from the server, and then I have another render that's suspended, that's like refetching the data from the server. And if for whatever reason that render bails it doesn't change any of the data that's on my screen.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that, because they said really there was a thing that how it breaks with start transition. So this is how we got into learning more about start transition, which is another React 18 API. But without a standard cache, they basically couldn't provide start transition. So that's how I think it ties to this idea, because so start transition is, do you want to talk about what it is? I can pull it up here.
Do
you know what it is?
It's you start transitioning to a new state, and you don't render until that state is ready.
You don't commit your tree
we can't say the term render, because it's like, is rendering start running the component? Is rendering your pixels are drawn to the screen?
Yeah.
So you start rendering the components that might suspend, but you don't actually draw the pixels on the screen until the components are unsuspended and they're ready to go. So it allows you to transition from, say, like blog post 1 to blog post 2 without having to deal with that middle state where like you're currently fetching blog post 1. So from the point of view of your program, it has blog post 1 rendered. There's something in the background fetching blog post 2, but your components that are rendered on the screen, they're only displaying blog post 1. They only know about blog post 1. And then when blog post 2 comes back, now they just re-render with blog post 2.
Right.
And there's more we can get into here.
Right. But this is like a new mechanism from the perspective of React, because if you ever click a link and you have to render like blog post /2, so far today, like React's just going to start rendering that. It's a render attempt. If you had an error, it would just crash your program. But if it starts fetching data, it's all that stuff is on the screen. And, we were talking earlier, it's kind of like the halting problem where we've talked before back in Ember days too, where it's like, sometimes you want to know what to fetch, but it's because you're working with a dynamic program, you have to render in order to know what you need to render. So, you have to render the component, because all we have in React is rendering. There's nothing like, here's how you transition from one route to the next. You can pass in an async function. React can run that while still keeping the UI responsive. And there's nothing like that. It's all components. It's only rendering. So,
well, there will be.
There will be. So that's kind of the mental model here, where before you would just have to start rendering the component right away, which is why you're getting all these thorny issues. You're rendering something that's not really in the complete state from your perspective. You'd like to be able to actually render it off to the side, let it finish, keep your app in the old state, so it's still on the first route, or maybe you're showing something different. And then, like you said, once all those async steps finish in the rendering cycle, now you have a sync component that's ready, just as if you were like toggling a button. So it's kind of this back to this turning the async into sync. And like you just said, it's a transition. So this is like now a first class way to do this.
Yep.
And there's so much with the trees here being consistent, which is why the cache is important.
Right. I think the easiest way to visualize this, and I might be just too boring here, but like you have a component and it takes a blog post ID, and it has some state like blog post content, and then it has an effect that takes that blog post ID, fetches it from your CMS, and then like set blog post content to the response of that fetch. And that effect has a dependency array of ID. Mm-hmm. So every time the ID changes, you are going to get new blog post content. That fetch is going to rerun. And so when you first render, like you render with blog post 1 and it fetches it, and it sets the content, and then you render it with blog post 2. And right there, like just right there, before our effect runs with the new blog post 2 ID, we're in this really weird state, because our blog post content state is that of blog post 1, but our ID is blog post 2. And so like your program isn't consistent, and
it's not consistent from a like semantic perspective. Like you might add some loading state or whatever, and it's like correct program in the sense that you're rendering a component with like blog post 1 in state and blog post 2 ID as a prop.
But it's not like consistent. Yeah. So what's like consistent after playing with like these demos?
It's
like
not
consistent is a word that I like. But, but it's no one would say to you like, oh, we need to blog post 1 with blog post ID 2 with blog post 1 content.
Right.
Like from the if you were to like draw a state chart of your application,
Right.
like that, you're not thinking about that.
Right.
And then you hit this bug. You're like, oh yeah, of course, because my state is like the last fetch blog
Right.
post and my effect is now in the middle of running. So it's no problem. I'll just like, before my fetch kicks off, I'll just set blog post content to an empty string. And so you do that and it solves a problem. But then you're like, wait, hold on. Is blog post 2, like, is it an empty blog post? Or is the data being fetched? Because now I can't tell. I just know that I have blog post 2 and an empty string.
Right.
But they might just fill in with a blog post in a few seconds.
Right.
So then you're like, okay, I need it is loading. So then you add is loading state and like you've solved this problem. But it's just it's a very weird state because you never start out saying like, oh, I'm going to explicitly like create this state in my application. It's always like we need like a term for this. It's like a response state. It's like
reaction. You're coding in a reactionary way.
Yes.
Because you're encountering intermediate states that aren't part of the domain of what you're trying to do. You know, in its traditional SSR app, like you click a link, you've sent the request with the new param, and like the browser is waiting. And so you only ever see it after the fact. This is kind of like that new thing that we have.
Yes.
But when we put all that code into effects, it makes it really hard and confusing. And it introduces a lot of bugs because, like you're saying, I mean, the story you just told is like perfect explanation because as soon as you click link 2, you run that effect, you're in this weird state. What's happening?
Dude,
in the meantime, the user could be interacting with the app. You could lose there's a lot of weird intermediate stuff that could happen there.
There's so many bugs we introduce here. And then also too, like fetching blog post 2 is usually fast, right? It's usually like 200 milliseconds. So who cares if our app is buggy for 200 milliseconds? Usually like our users and our product managers and our QA testers, they don't notice this sort of thing. But like imagine you have like blog post ID 2, you have blog post 1's content, blog post ID 2 is being fetched. And then all of a sudden, like you edit the content and click save.
Right.
Like, wait, hold on. Where should that save go?
Right.
Should that save go? And then like, well, okay, like I can like track like last blog post ID is 1. So if I do an edit, well, is like you just
reset. You're done. You're just formic reset values territory. All these kinds of things makes these components very hard to read about.
And the thing is, I'm just going to keep going back to this like consistent state thing. This isn't like a state that you planned to draw in your application. Like if I'm on blog post 1, I should be able to go off and fetch blog post 2, but I want my app to remain responsive in blog post 1 because guess what? That's a blog post that's rendered while I'm fetching blog post 2.
Right.
And so start transition allows this. We can keep the app in blog post 1. Blog post 1 is rendered where we can edit blog post 1, delete things, whatever.
Interact with updates if it's real-time push updates or something. Notifications about it if you're on a channel on Twitch or something.
And then when blog post 2 comes back, we're unsuspended, the transition ends, and then we just re-render. And guess what? We get to re-render like synchronously.
Right.
Because we have everything we need. So we just immediately go from blog post 1 to blog post 2.
Right.
And we never have to describe the in-between. There's no more setting content to empty string, setting loading to true, and God, writing tests, being embarrassed when our QA comes back and says, hey, I
hit back button or something. Yeah, absolutely.
And
it starts, the story you tell is really good, and it starts to make sense why you are trying, like from a Suspense perspective, you're trying to pull the async parts out and delegate to the parent. Why you want the parent to orchestrate all of this? Because you want these components to be self-contained. You want them to be consistent from the perspective of they have what they need.
I have blog post 2. My ID is blog post 2, and I'm either suspended or I have blog post 2 content. That's it.
Yeah.
I can't be blog post 2 with blog post 1 content. It's just, no, I'm blog post 2, I'm suspended or I have the content.
It's crazy how like talking about it seems like obviously that's how it should work. Like that seems like that's obviously the mental model we all want, but like we've been plumbing for so long, you know, because we're working with such low level. It feels like such a jump in the level of abstraction.
Not only that, but when you hit these bugs, your reaction is never, oh, my programming model is wrong.
Right.
Unless you're like, there's like 10 people in the world that can recognize that.
Yeah, like I'm a bad React programmer. That's what you think.
You just
when
think,
you hit these bugs.
When I hit these bugs, I don't even think that. I think, well, first of all, I always think I'm a bad React programmer. But then I look at your React code and I'm like, oh, okay, it's like could be worse. No,
Fair.
I'm in my React developer. I have my React developer hat on. I'm like, oh, that's so easy to solve. I'll just create a new state called isLoading.
Yeah.
And I'll toggle isLoading to true and then isLoading to false. And it's like, boom, problem solved.
Yeah, you got all the knives right there.
Yeah, I write a
source.
test case.
Yep.
I ship it to production.
Yep.
I close that ticket.
Yep.
And I sail off into the sunset. But it's true. You don't. And then you see this transition stuff and you're like, oh my God. Like this is what
I've been missing this for so long. I didn't even realize it.
Yeah. And then it's like, how many bugs do I have in my applications now? I mean, I have so many. Yeah.
So yeah, from the docs, it says transitions. Let's revisit this demo from the previous page about Suspense for data fetching. When we click the next button to switch the active profile or the blog post in your analogy, the existing page data immediately disappears and we can see the loading indicator for the whole page again. So that's triggering like the outermost suspense boundary.
Yep.
We can call this an undesirable loading state. It would be nice if we could skip it and wait for some content to load before transitioning to the new screen. So that's like, you could do that today, but you'd be hacking together some crazy stuff, right? If you wanted to trigger a load and then there's no idiomatic way to do it. And that's exactly what this is.
That's where you'd have like last fetch content, current fetch content. Yeah, I guess you're right. You could like create you could create a cache in user space that remembers all these things.
Yes. But everyone's going to look different. So React offers a new built-in useTransition hook to help with this. We can use it in 3 steps. So you just add this useTransition hook. And then in the app component where you're changing the param, let's say clicking on a different blog post, you get a useTransition hook, you invoke it, you pass in a timeout milliseconds, and you get 2 things back from it. Start transition is a function and is pending is a Boolean. It's React telling us whether transition is ongoing. And so now when you click to switch the blog post ID from 1 to 2, you use the start transition function. And then within that, you start using the other hooks or fetch calls to suspend. And that's exactly what it does. So this is why the cache for data fetching is so important. You have the one tree currently mounted and it's blog post 1. And when you start a transition, it's almost the way I'm thinking about it now is like there's another version of your app running. Like React, because of this halting problem where we can't just start rendering to see if what we want is what we want, if we have a state, we need to run this second page somewhere. Throwing a promise lets React have control, and it's a pull base instead of a push base. We talked about that a couple months ago, why it's such an important part of the thrown promise mechanism, because if you just were to push things, then React can't do it. It kind of all makes sense though, because now you have this one tree. Now you have another function that then a transition that's throwing promises via Suspense. React's going to keep asking for it until it gets the right version and is able to build up a new tree of your app, but in this like bomb shelter over here. And meanwhile, it's as if the user never even clicked that button in your app. Like your app is in the old state.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's completely reactive and it could receive new updates. The user could cancel and go to another thing. React could be doing this in n different times, actually. So it could be making n versions of your app in this bomb shelter, constructing these trees. And then once it's ready, it can just swap the tree out because now you have a new consistent state of your app. And you can go back. This is why it helps with transitions. You can have like 2 versions of your app with trees and transition between them. You can go back and forward. And this is the idea of the cache. Sometimes they were talking on Twitter about this cache for data fetching, and people were like, isn't that an optimization? Aren't caches an optimization? But it's more about this part.
I really liked that question because I was like, yeah, like as web programmers, we actually think of like, oh, my thing works fine without a cache. It's just slow or whatever. So I did like that comment.
But that's my current understanding of all this stuff. And again, like back to the install script analogy, you couldn't really do this without a cache because the steps take too long and it wouldn't be feasible or practical. So now if you have a shared cache that everyone uses, not just for data fetching, for animations, once you have a first class way to do it in React, React can now do this orchestration where it's building these different trees. And it knows if like a tree is stale and it needs to like evict it for a key or whatever. And that's the whole point. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's real exciting. I mean, I kind of feel like like you're like leveling up.
Yeah,
it's like a UI developer, and that's just how I felt playing with it.
Totally. So you actually got to play with some of the demos because you saw there was like a Reddit demo from Dan back in the day, back when they first introduced transition, right?
Yeah, I think in that Twitter thread Dan links to a GitHub discussion, and I think Andrew Clark posts a bunch of explanation of like how this stuff works, why it's needed, and then he's got a couple demos, and the demos will fetch data from Reddit, and you can like change the subreddits, and you can comment out all the transitions, and it works kind of like how you think a React app would work. Like I go from like the JavaScript subreddit to the front end subreddit, and like, okay, now my app renders like a loading spinner because I'm now fully in the state of the second front end subreddit.
Right.
I've left the JavaScript subreddit, and then you use transitions, and you realize like, oh, I'm actually still on the JavaScript.
I'm still there,
until until the render for the front end subreddit is like consistent.
Yeah.
I can render top to bottom.
Yeah.
So that means rendering with like the subreddit ID of front end, and then also with all the front end posts fetched.
Right.
And so like, wow, does that make the program so much simpler for you to understand?
It's crazy. The code's simpler, and you're like you said, like you're looking at the old posts and you're able to interact with them.
Yep.
He makes them fade out a little bit to indicate that they're loading, but the point is you're still in that world, you know, and it's like
you can be reactive there.
Yeah.
You can you have to imagine you could like delete posts from there, or,
exactly,
whatever you want to do.
It's pretty awesome. So yeah, it's really, really cool.
I'm not sure what, like a bunch of these APIs, are like, they have like the unstable prefix.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure like what the current thinking is there. And again, I've just kind of played with this from like the demos, but you can definitely see like, okay, like if I was writing effects, how would I do this? If I was writing suspense, how would I do this? And then like, oh, this is actually like kind of like the best of both worlds, where I get to have all my state and not transition to it until it's ready.
Yep. So bring it full circle back to my demo for my last video last week, where it's like an email inbox. I made this component suspend after initial render so that you can first render a single loading spinner, even though you have two data loading components. But then once your sidebar is rendered, you want to add a nested suspense boundary. It's possible. It might be fun to rework that with a single suspense boundary at the top. And then when you're transitioning between messages, maybe you would put it in the parent. I'm not really sure.
I think it would go above, like the message component would suspend.
Yeah.
And then
if you're
that,
transitioning,
you can decide what to do. So whatever renders a message component can like the Reddit example.
That's like the Reddit example. You can actually keep the previous message
and like maybe gray it out or something.
Or just have a little indicator in the top. That'd be interesting.
So this is like
that's pretty interesting.
This is actually something that I noticed when I was messing with the demos. We'll link the GitHub issue and the demos in the show notes. But I was like, okay, like there's two ways for me to go into a loading state.
Yeah.
I'm making air quotes here. Like one is I can have my component suspend.
Right.
Which isn't necessarily, it kind of made me realize like suspending isn't necessarily loading.
Always what you wanted. Okay.
It's more like suspending is like I'm not ready. Which we just map to means I'm loading the data.
Right.
But you're basically saying I'm not ready.
Right.
And then when you start transitioning, like you're not rendering and suspending. These words are so when you start transitioning, you're going to say, okay, I'm not going to render this new tree that I'm transitioning to until it's ready. And so you're not rendering that tree and rendering the suspense boundary. You're like preparing it to render it when it's fully ready. So now you have like another loading indicator, and that is like I start a transition. So the useTransition hook, the Boolean it returns. They said like, what did the doc say? I call it like is transitioning.
Yeah,
I think they called it something else
like that. It's
is pending maybe is
pending.
Is pending. So that Boolean flips from false to true. And so you're in old state and you're transitioning to a new state because that thing is now true.
Right.
So it's like, okay, I have another way to display a loading spinner, right?
Right.
In my JSX, I can do like if is loading.
Right.
So it's interesting. I feel like
there's multiple ways to do the same thing.
Yeah,
like when you run into this problem, I'm transitioning from one post to another. What should I actually do?
Yeah. Do I want to suspend or do I want to render the old post and like show a little indicator that like the new thing is loading? And I feel like this is a thing where the only thing that's going to give me the answer is like I need to just like I need to touch a stove and get burnt a few times.
Yeah.
So with your messages UI, I think like us writing it,
we'll learn a lot.
We might have some light bulb moments.
Yep. I do like that I went through the exercise, even if it ends up that transition was a better solution to that particular problem. I like that I went through the exercise because it's nice solving the problem with just a suspense primitive. Like you can do so much with that. And the fact that they work with nesting and you can add and remove them dynamically to the tree at any time means you can solve a lot of these problems with just suspense.
I'm not qualified at all to say this, so I'm just going to say it.
Isn't that
as you do as a podcast, as you do when you're on a podcast. Your video with like, so first of all, I think nested suspense boundaries is like totally
separate problem space.
Yeah. So, and I like when I was playing with the transition stuff, I never thought like, oh, we could totally do this in Sam's video. Like I didn't think it mapped as like a replacement for your video.
I don't know, because that Reddit example, I mean, it's basically you have one initial splash screen that's loading, and then you have some intermediate loading state.
I know, but if you were going to go and say like, oh, if I'm transitioning, just redisplay the loading spinner, then in that case, like, no, you should just use a suspense boundary. We should just immediately transition from like message 1 to a suspended loading of message 2 to then message 2.
I agree actually now, like thinking about it and the way it was saying, what it was saying, the way it introduces transition is when we click on a new page that has a component that suspends, we don't want to show that we transition to the loading screen right away. Wouldn't it be nice if we could keep the old data around? In the inbox example, that's not what you're doing.
It's an undesirable loading state.
Whereas in this case, we actually have a desirable loading state, which is something that we want nested in the UI. So like in Mail on the Mac app, when you click a different message, you wouldn't want to show the old message with the new message selected.
Well,
so that tells me it's not about transition.
The beauty of transition is I don't think you would select the message until it was ready to be rendered.
But you want to show that you want to give immediate feedback. You actually click the button.
Yep.
Whereas like...
so I think you would transition to this.
No,
I think fine. You would. I think your video is appropriate.
That's what I think too, because suspense is about showing loading feedback and simplifying the component, and transition is about showing old data instead of a new loading right away, which is just slightly different. What's an example of an app where you would want to show the old data while you're clicking around? Like, does that ever happen on Twitter?
I think. I
guess like Twitter, routing. If you hit a button, like sometimes you could imagine just keeping the home screen written while you're loading your notifications or something like that.
Yeah, I think if you take like go back to like a server rendered website, when you click links,
you're looking at the old page.
You're looking at the old
page.
Loading, but it is loading. It's not loading in your computer in React. It's being prepared in a back end with a database, but.
It's true. Yeah. You're following links. You don't want to just look at a loading screen if you're looking at an article or something,
I think that could be really powerful.
It's interesting
for routing, because I think with routing, if you imagine a router, and let's just like be like really terrible, like our routes are fast. Like our routes need data, and our page components that our routes render need data. And so they're going to suspend while they fetch, but they're not going to suspend for like 3 seconds. They're going to suspend for like 100 milliseconds if they're fast. So if you're like clicking links, you don't want to get into like, okay, I click a link, I immediately transition to a new state. That state's now suspended. Maybe like a loading spinner for 100 milliseconds is too jarring, but I have to render something. So I render a blank page, and then the data comes back, component unsuspends, and I render the actual data for the page. I think I'd rather just like have some state like I'm transitioning to this next page, but keep this page rendered.
Yep.
And it's really cool that we can do that.
Yep.
So, I mean, I guess like we'd have to see it.
Right.
Like this, I'm getting like a little hand wave now, but
yeah, that's pretty interesting though, man. It's really cool. I was like upgrading my fitness side project, and all the code is so clean there, in the routes that I use Suspense, and just the initial loading indicator showing up and all that. It's really nice. Yeah, I had fun upgrading that. I actually have tests for it, which is good. I upgraded from like Next 10 to 12, Tailwind 2 to 3. It's actually it was all pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
And then I actually found a bug in like my ring component, and I upgraded frame rate motion too, and it actually showed up. I don't know if it was showing up before, but I saw it. It was just like the initial state and the animated state, but yeah, no, it was pretty cool. And then there was something else interesting about that. What was it? Oh yeah, my tests time thing. That was just a little thing, the time zone issue.
Oh yeah, what did you what you want to talk through that?
Sure, yeah. I just had some tests, and the app shows a week view. It's like the fitness app on an iPhone, and you have like Sunday through Saturday, and you choose a day. And when you're on the day, if you've like went to the gym that day, it has like a check mark. And so I have a test where, all this is depending on time. So all the tests are like use SciDot clock in Cypress to say, okay, it's January 1st, 2010 or whatever. And let's start out on Tuesday and have 3 goals of this. And so the test says like, we should, if there's an event in the back for, the gym on Tuesday, I should see a check on Tuesday. And you start out on Tuesday as today. And then every time I pushed it to CI, it failed. And, Cypress has the actions are so cool. It was actually the first time in a long time I'd worked with the GitHub action for Cypress. And I added the artifacts that it saves for the failed test. And it was like the easiest thing ever. I don't even know what I did. It was like 2 lines I copied from somewhere and just worked. No install, nothing. No debugging.
It's so good.
And then just in the tab, you have like an artifacts button. It's just like amazing. And I was like kind of skeptical because I was like, I haven't worked on this in a while. Like this is going to be a pain in the butt. Maybe I'll just wait to like pair on this with Ryan. And then I was like, let me just take a look at the failed test and see if it tells me anything. And sure enough, it showed the wrong day. So Tuesday was the day with the gym, but Wednesday was red, which meant it was today. And on my computer, it wasn't. I was like, so I tried everything. I tried setting the clock to like 000 time with the time zone in it. And then it still was a day off on the server, on the CI server and GitHub. And I was like, what else did I try? I tried, there's a TZ environment variable in Node. So you can run your test with TZ equals like America/New York, and then Cypress run or NPM run, and Node will use that as the time zone. But it was still giving me an error. It wasn't working. There's some people who are saying Chrome would respect that, but it's the browser. If you open up a browser and you type new date, you're getting the time zone of the location of the browser system. So none of that worked. And I was, I had those commits that are like, again, trying again, fix,
test.
And then eventually I found a GitHub action called like set time zone. And so it just says uses set time zone, America, New York, and boom.
This is where I think GitHub actions really, really shine, where you can just like, it's like the declarative configuration and not.
Yeah, you were saying it's so high level and declarative, you could actually imagine a UI for building your action, which you would have never thought back in the day, like setting up Travis scripts and stuff.
Yeah, and I think I will say it's come a long way. I think like 2 years ago, we did a podcast and I talked about like my initial impressions of GitHub actions, and it still felt like
low level.
It still felt like I was setting up Circle CI, where it's like run this command with like this node version and this matrix and blah, blah, blah. And now it feels a lot more. I think the Cypress add-on is like
a good example of like
just home run with GitHub actions, where it's just like run npm start. It's going to spin up an app on localhost 3000, and then it's going to run my test against it. And that's like
wait and serve, none of that.
None of that anymore. So
no, super reliable. Also, there was a part of me that was, even though I was frustrated and it took me like an hour to figure this out, I was so happy I was seeing the same failures, because the first time I was like, I've never had like a real failure in this test suite. It's been pretty solid. I took a time to make sure all this was pretty good. And I was like, oh God, what is this going to be? Let me just try rerunning it and see if it passes, but it kept failing. So that was good.
Man, I just need to like this app that I worked on at TED was like our big conferences app. And we're deal with conferences in different time zones and managing that. And we had this bug where the time zone, just like the times we were using, when daylight savings happened, it would shift by an hour.
Oh my gosh.
So this bug would show up. Sorry, this test failure would show up in like 6 months from now. So it's like there was a time where it was daylight savings and we pushed code and like just all our like a bunch of our tests start failing.
Yeah.
And we're just like, why is like code from 4 months ago now failing? And like, this is like, I don't want to go debug this. I have like work that it was just like, I just hate time zones. I hate them.
I was actually going to ask you though, like, so that solution is pretty cool. You have a GitHub action, you're in script. But does that mean if we were on a trip to California, potentially we could run this? Should this actually be done in the GitHub script? I kind of think it should be done in the test, if possible. I think it should be mocked out in the test. But to my understanding, there's no way to do that. There were some people who said when you set size.clock to a new date that's in UTC, it's always UTC. It was still the problem where I think if you're using a date constructor, it's going to use a time zone from the thing. I couldn't figure out how to make the time zone consistent.
I think
but you see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
I actually don't know if it's the right way to solve it.
I had to do this on Ember because I needed time zones with like drip or something.
Okay.
Where like we send off newsletter. I forget why, but I needed to capture the user's time zone, write it to a database, and then use that.
Because like I think it should be.
I can't remember. But anyway, I
bet there's a way. Mock out. Basically, you need to mock out. I don't know.
I used Moment.
I
used Moment, which I know is like out of flavor now. But at the time, I used Moment, and they have like a time zone library, and it was like now you set the time zone that you want. So like in your test, you would say like Moment time zone is. I mean, I guess in Cypress it's tricky because like the 2-frame thing, but in Ember Map we didn't have that. So I would set the time zone to whatever, and then it's kind of like dependency injection.
Yeah, every date thing.
I'm not new dating.
Yeah.
I'm using Moment to initialize all my dates, and then that thing is
Yeah.
So I did something like that. It was a while ago, but I remember being like, okay, so now like I have an interface that I go through when I need a date, right? I don't just new date. I have to go through Moment, and it guarantees a time zone.
Right. If that is the answer for me, that's fine too. Like if I need to remove all uses of new date, but I do like just starting out with new date and then within Cypress being able to do side.clock because that's like pretty awesome. So.
I don't know, man.
Yeah,
I don't have a good answer here.
Yeah.
Like I feel like every time it's just like, you know, queue up 5 Stack Overflow tabs.
Right. Yeah. But it is cool to have the test with all the data and like this. I mean, that's like always going to be cool to me. Like you open up such a data-driven app that's about days, and it's like you have a completely isolated environment that you control. So
yeah,
pretty cool stuff. So why don't we wrap it there? Yeah. What are you working on this week? What's your video this week? I need a video. I have a few ideas. Actually, I'm going to start talking. Okay, you go first.
I'm doing modal routing in Next.js.
Oh God. See you in a month.
Actually, I have I have it like boiled down to the most concise, small example. I think
we'll see about that. We'll do a run through soon.
It's Next is cool because they give you an escape hatch for everything, and then like sometimes you're like, I wonder if when I'm in the submarine and I'm like 10,000 feet below sea level, if I should have opened that escape hatch.
I think it more like, here, choose your weapon, your crowbar, you beat yourself up with a rope you're gonna hang yourself with,
foot gun,
the old foot gun.
I think it's cool.
And true.
I think it. One of the things I like about this is you get to see like how a bunch of pieces in Next.js can come together. Mm-hmm. Whether you do modal routing or not, just explain a few APIs in Next.js and how to think through things like this. So
this came up with the podcast app, right?
Yeah, the podcast app is like it's pretty gnarly. Complicated.
I mean, it's pretty awesome. Where you can load a page and it doesn't fetch the background. But then when you navigate there, it still renders it.
So I have like that, but like the simple example of that. It can get like really out of hand, and the podcast app has started to do that. So it's
That's cool.
Escape hatches.
Yep. I started working on, I think this transition stuff could be cool, but I want a little more time for like research or whatever.
Absolutely.
I was going to do this forms thing. So I started working on a demo. It's just a dumb trick, but I wanted to do it. Also because I like, if I do dumb things, sometimes people like tell me better ways to do them. But remember when I used state and didn't have a state setter, and I just wanted like a snapshot of a form data while you're going to edit it?
Yep.
It was kind of like that.
Cool.
So it's, let's say you have like, in the fitness app, you have categories like nutrition and fit and working out. And then you create a goal that's attached to a category. And you can only have one goal per category per week. So when you go to create a new goal, you choose a category. And you can only choose what you don't have a goal for yet. So what happened was, let's say, you have like 2 browsers open or something. You render the form and you choose nutrition, but then someone else has already made a goal for nutrition while you're editing the form. And then, so now nutrition disappears, your app re-renders, and like your app's in an inconsistent state. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It also happened even without that, where it was like you chose nutrition to create that form. You're in a modal window showing the form. You hit save. It goes to the parent. The parent now saves it. And now available categories doesn't include that. And so your like component errors because it's like trying to render a form for nutrition, but it's no longer there. So like available category ID is wrong. And like the selected category is not there. And so I ran into this like in this UI and solved it by when you first render the form with the selected category, you make a snapshot of all the data. And it's basically just use state, here's what you're working with. And that way, like you could do the validation and check if there's still an available category when you try to save it. And if not, you would show a message like there's already been a goal created for this since you hit edit. It would be like hitting edit on a Stack Overflow, having an update, and then the message saying you're editing a stale version of this question, click here to refresh, or in GitHub. So it's that kind of problem.
Nice.
And so I think that's actually better is like when you render a form to go edit data, you want to take a snapshot of the data at the time when the user clicked edit. And then if there's some validation you need to do after the fact or the data changes and you're not re-rendering out from underneath them. So I'm trying to come up with the smallest version of that. But I think you can get into a bug pretty quick. When you have a relationship and you have an available thing that goes away. I think that's the way to do it. You're doing like a
filter and the thing no longer there.
Exactly. Because I started with just users and editing their name and tried to do a thing where like the name changes in the background and the prop comes through and now like what do you do? But I think the relationship is the way to go.
Yeah. There was a thread this morning on like forms and React, and it was like there's like a sad face.
Yeah, I saw that.
Which was the way we write forms with like state, and then there was another one that was like
the remix example.
Not even the remix one. Yeah, it was just
maybe it was, but it was target dot.
It was basically uncontrolled form.
Yeah.
So you just render a bunch of inputs, and then your on submit does
reads it from the
event.target dot. First name dot value
to
get the first name element from the form.
Right.
I thought that was pretty nice because thinking about it and like, I only control my form inputs so I can read them. Like, I have no other.
Then it is true. As soon as you do validation or something.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you have if you're just doing a login form, you should do, it's easiest to get going with just type email required. In that way, like the browser's going to do it. It's going to look way better on the phone than anything you're going to do in React.
Absolutely. So, but I still do a controlled input with that. It's just, I don't know. Yeah. It's just,
Formic makes that stuff pretty easy.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And also in this, I will link this thread, but, man, people are really opinionated about their form.
Passionate about that.
I thought someone was going to get stabbed in that thread. I mean, people were yelling and use Formic, don't use this. Remix people were in there. It was.
Yeah. Interesting. I know those are hard. I mean, yeah. Forms never fun. I mean, the primitives in Rails were awesome. So if people have never seen like a Rails or Laravel, the way they handle relationships and stuff, there's a lot there that's pretty cool. A lot of that informs how we end up writing our forms in React. We're basically using that as a mental model.
Yep.
But it's certainly not like a standard thing that's like everyone does it the same way in React, which would be nice. Maybe the React team will tackle that after transition and suspense land.
I think that ship has sailed. I think that's a user land problem.
Yeah. Cool. All right. I guess that's it for this week. Happy January 17th. I kind of like recording on Monday. It's nice.
Yeah.
So this should come out like Wednesday or something. But thanks for listening, everyone. Hope you're doing well. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
See ya.